Thank you all very much. So Joy asked me to bring a historian's perspective to this. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of the history that's relevant when we're thinking about this and try to do it very briefly, which is not always my forte. So the first thing I think is really important to think about is that 160 years ago, there were no jails, there were no prisons in what is now Western Washington. Okay? And so when we've got to dismiss the idea that prisons and jails are a normal, natural feature of our existence. Coast Salish people had 10, 15,000 years here, okay, in which they didn't build any jails or prisons. And 10 or 15,000 years, you're going to have some social problems, you're going to have some social conflicts, right? They had functional, sustainable ways of dealing with people who violated the social order, people who harmed other people. But beginning in the 1850s, we begin to see both colonization and confinement here in what is now Whatcom County. And so it's important for us to understand the first Whatcom County jail, the territorial courthouse, it still stands down there on Holly Street there, oldest brick building in Washington. It was purchased by the territory in 1858. They bought it off a failing businessman, okay? And so we want to also understand that throughout there have been these connections between the biggest businesses in this area and the incarceration industry. A merchant named Richards built this fireproof storehouse on the waterfront in 1858 because he thought he was going to make a lot of money off the Fraser Canyon gold rush. But the British Empire made those miners instead go through Victoria to get their permits. And so it meant that the boom died really fast. And he had the territory bail him out, had him buy his useless, low-value sort of warehouse, turn it into the territorial courthouse and the initial jail. And for the most part, it was empty. They didn't have enough people to put in it. Right? Dirty Dan Harris spent some time in there. He's a regular troublemaker around here. But for the most part, right, what's important to understand from this is that we have a short history of incarceration here compared to the longer scale of history. Now, soon after that, a really important thing happened for understanding incarceration in America, and that's in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, crucial thing, it ends slavery. It says that involuntary servitude will not be allowed in this country, except, and this is the loophole, except when duly convicted of a crime. No involuntary servitude except when duly convicted of a crime. And this is when we're going to start to see a massive growth of incarceration throughout this country. Okay? And we can see the direct connection to the 13th Amendment, that the growth of the incarceration system here is the continuation of slavery by other means. It was about exploitation and racialized exploitation, but it's one that through the 13th Amendment then becomes genericized. I'm going to jump forward. I'm going to skip some middle ground and jump forward to the 1960s. Okay? And to 1961, when President Eisenhower was leaving office, he had a speech. And it was a speech in which he coined this term, the military-industrial complex. Okay, Eisenhower had spent his whole life in the military, his whole adult life as a military officer. And one of his big campaign promises when he first ran was about resolving the situation in Korea, which a lot of people thought that Truman had gotten into a stalemated mess. Eisenhower thinks he brings the peace. He gets an armistice in Korea in his first year in office. But he realizes over his 8 years in office that the United States has entered a permanent war economy. It never demobilizes from the Korean War. And he coins this term with his speechwriters, the military-industrial complex, to explain how the wolves are guarding the henhouse now. The people who are explaining what the threats are the exact people who benefit from this environment of peril, right? And from this idea that we need to spend more and more because we're constantly under threat. And he said that the officials in the military, the generals, are very cozy with the defense contractors and CEOs. They meet, they speak the same language. Sometimes they're the same people. A lot of retired officers, military officers, including my Uncle Dean, who's a defense contractor now. This means that there's a lot of collusion in a lot of ways in which, again, the same people who we're supposed to be relying on for accurate information have a vested interest in telling us we're in trouble. And so we start to see in the 1960s a number of forces that are going to drive incarceration up even higher. Because even though incarceration grows after the Civil War, in 1970, only 1 in 1,000 people in this country were under correctional supervision. By 2010, 50 years later, that number is 1 in 100. Okay? 1% of the country under some form of correctional supervision. And that happens just in 50 years. A lot of different things force that, and a lot of those things are relevant for us to think about. Okay, one is that there's a massive change in how mental health is treated and is done. There's a lot of deinstitutionalization in the 60s, which is a good thing because those institutions were nasty places. But very often people are just transferred from mental institutions into the revolving door of the criminal justice system. Okay? And so we deinstitutionalized, but didn't actually find a way to deal with mental health issues. Also beginning in the 1960s, there was a massive increase in drug use across the United States. First with cocaine and then with heroin, we've seen a 100-fold increase in chemical dependence issues. It's another issue that is not well addressed by this system. We know 60% of the people in the Whatcom County Jail only have a misdemeanor traffic violation or ticket citation. The 40% with felonies though, right? And people say, oh, well, 40% have felonies. Those are bad dudes, right? Most common thing, controlled substance violation, the #1 booked felony in the Whatcom County Jail. So we're dealing with unaddressed substance abuse issues. Another thing we're seeing relevant for Whatcom County in the 60s and 70s, driving the growth of prisons, is deindustrialization. Lose a lot of jobs, manufacturing, a lot of quality jobs in this country. And it creates what Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer, wrote a really good book called Golden Gulag about California. She said this creates a surplus population, people who have no place within existing systems. And our society has decided to warehouse these people in jails, in prisons. Okay, and that gives us this tenfold growth, again, from 1970 up until 2010. The one possible bright spot of this sad story is that we use that number 2010 because we've noticed in the past few years that that was a peak. Okay, that was a turning point. And due to a number of reasons, right, that the jails and prisons seem to fill some sort of economic need at first, right? Warehousing that surplus population. But it's become clear that they are really inefficient ways to do that, and they're actually major drags on the economy. And so we've started to see, since the financial crisis, the beginnings of attempts around this country to reduce how many people go into the system, reduce how long they stay there, and to give them better outcomes when they come out. Whatcom County is now poised on that, right? We're at a moment where we've seen nationally crime rates declining since about 1991, 1992. Locally, they've declined a lot. We can see incarceration has peaked and is declining in around the country slightly. We can be part of that. We can be part of that reduction and bring things down, or we can make a really bad investment at the absolute wrong time. Okay, this is like investing in steam power in 1900, right? This is making the wrong investment at the wrong time, because what we're going to find is that this era from the 1970s to the early 2000s was an aberration. It's not the way that any healthy society should be, incarcerating 1% of its population. I'll end there. Thank you all very much.